Yes.
Thanks. So my second question is for Bill. So we're calling this a progressive dialogue. So how would you characterize a progressive position on U.S.-Africa relations in contrast to the Obama administration?
That's a hard question. And I have to introduce it by saying that I'm wearing several hats here. I'm editor of Africa Focus Bulletin. I also am guilty of participating in organizing this event. And I had the privilege of working on a report for the Solidarity Center, which involved interviews with some of the trade unionists here. But what I'm going to say is my opinion and my opinion only, because I don't think there is one progressive position on all the issues, which is why we need dialogue. But we do need a different framework. And the fundamental issue about frameworks is how people understand when they say U.S.-Africa relations. Are you talking basically about the government and some of the big NGOs? And in what way does one understand this? The ways that one rejects are traditional paternalistic aid, the pictures of starving babies, the image of the Africa is desperate and it's just asking for handouts. Now we reject that. Obama's rejecting that too. But how this summit is projected. But how it's being projected is that it's all about trade and investment. And Africa is rising. And now there are opportunities to do business. And that's true to a certain extent. Africa is rising in some respects. There is opportunity to do business. The problem is that not all business is good business for the majority of the people. The question is, who gets the profits? Not just the split between the US and Africa, but the split between the rich and poor in every country. Who is getting, if the oil companies and the officials they are paying off are the ones who are getting the benefit, well then the people on either side of the Atlantic are not getting the benefit. So one has to have a different framework. And for some of us who've been around for a while, the framework is in what may be a rather old-fashioned word of solidarity, and interpreted in the words of Samora Machel, former president of Mozambique. International solidarity is not an act of charity. It is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains towards the main objective. And in that fight, you do not judge people ultimately by their nationality, by the color of their skin, or by other characteristics. What I learned from Frelimo, and obviously it's not unique to Frelimo, but that's just my personal experience in Mozambique, is that you judge people by what they do, by what they are committed to. And the differences, in the most general terms, without going into specific policy prescriptions, is between the people who are out for their own benefit and for a small elite, and who are grabbing more and more of the world, and the people who say it's human rights for all, it's social justice for all, economic growth is not enough, we need growth that is shared. We need prosperity that is shared. We need human rights that apply to everybody, not just to those who fit a certain description or who manage to get their hands on a lot of money. And in that context, we think it's not constructive to talk about U.S.-Africa relations as if it's just a matter of policy on particular issues. It's a framework in which we confront common issues in a common world. Just a few examples. I'm not going into these, one for time, and I don't have the expertise. You'll hear about various of them during the day. But let me talk about one that's not on the agenda with a specific panel. Refugee rights. the issue of the children who are crossing the border, who have come from Central America, the question of, do they get their due rights, or do they just get picked up and deported after all the violence they have suffered? Well, you have plenty of issues of the same kind on the African continent, in which neighboring countries have accepted actually hundreds of thousands of refugees, but their rights are at issue, particularly if they're stored in camps for forever. And currently the issue of what rights refugees have is a very big issue for Somalis in Kenya and for people from all over the continent in South Africa, whether they're from Somalia or from Mozambique. And the issue of, does everybody have the same human rights wherever they come from, is an issue there, and it's an issue obviously in Europe and in the people who are trying, people who die in the Mediterranean because they're trying to cross into Europe. Just like the people who die in the desert in southwest United States because they're trying to cross the border. And when we ask about these issues of rights, we also, that forces us, if we have any analysis, into analysis of why are people moving. And there are many reasons, and often they're complex. One is clearly when they're fleeing direct violence. One increasingly will be climate change. As places become difficult to grow food, people will move elsewhere, sometimes within their countries, sometimes across borders. And fundamentally, economic inequality. People have always moved in the world, historically, to get ahead or to escape difficult economic situations to go someplace else. As inequality increases, more movement is going to happen. It's going to continue to happen, and the people who are involved in that, a large number of them, will be abused and deported, and they will come back. So we have to relate then not only to the history of conflict and people who are recognized as refugees, to forced movement, where it's hard to say, are you moving to get ahead or are you moving to escape? Because really, how do you tell the difference? I mean, a professional moving is something, but if you're moving because that's the only way you can support your family and send money back, then that's forced as well, even though you may not officially qualify as a refugee. And when you get back, those conditions are not created in the countries purely internally. They come from internal problems and they come from external problems, both. Never only one or the other. So the conditions in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador are created by the countries there, but they're also created by the war on drugs and by previous U.S. military interventions. And that's something Africa is beginning to confront, particularly, there's a lot of talk about AFRICOM and stuff, but there's also the less known, the DEA and the war on drugs. And as the war on drugs expands, it actually doesn't control drugs, it actually expands the violence. And that is now happening in West Africa as well, with serving as a transit point from Latin America to Europe. So addressing a problem like this, you're not going to do it in one country. Climate change, which you'll hear a lot about this afternoon, that's an issue that affects the survival of our planet. Some people are more vulnerable and are hurt sooner, but there are already damages both in Africa, changed climate, more frequent drought in California, Katrina. There are refugees internally displaced from Katrina, and if Hurricane Sandy had hit more in Manhattan, you get the point. As these things happen, they affect all of us, and if the sea rises, I say if, I should say when the sea rises, because that's what we don't know when, it will flood the majority of Florida, will be underwater. A lot of Manhattan will be underwater, and Lagos will be underwater. And a fair amount of cities in East Africa as well. So our perspective is that somehow or another it has to be fighting on different fronts to confront common problems both at home and internationally, because every problem requires both. The final one, and then I'll bring to a close, is another of our panel is about what's the fancy term, illicit financial flows, tax evasion, and it's that there's estimates are, it's all estimates because everybody's guessing. There's $21 trillion stored in tax havens around the world. And it comes from everywhere. And the rich are escaping taxes and sending their money around the world to another country where nobody can keep track of it, and whether they're sending it to Delaware, or whether they're buying up Manhattan real estate, or whether they're sending it to Seychelles or Switzerland, it's money that is subtracted from the public domain. And you talk about all the budget crises and we don't have money. Well, if that money was being taxed, we would have money for schools, for water supply, for public health, and so on. I'm not an expert on any of these, but what I'm absolutely convinced is that they're connected, and we are connected, and it's not a matter of somebody in some place helping somebody someplace else. It's a matter of working together to change our countries and the world.